Chapter 6. What the Earth God Desired. The ship was tall and slender, and she was delicate. Her rails, masts, and bulwarks were exquisitely carved, and obviously not the work of a mortal craftsman. Though built of wood, the wood was not painted, but naturally shone blue and black and green, and a kind of deep smoky red. And her rigging was the colour of seaweed, and there were veins in the planks of her polished deck, like the roots of trees. And the sails on her 3 tapering masts were as fat and white and light as clouds on a fine summer day. The ship was everything that was lovely in nature. Few could look upon her and not feel delighted, as they might be delighted upon sighting a perfect view. In a word, the ship radiated harmony, and Elric could think of no finer vessel in which to sail against Prince Ercune and the dangers of the lands of Oin and Hugh. The ship sailed gently in the ground, as if upon the surface of a river, and the earth beneath the keel rippled as if turned momentarily to water. Wherever the keel of the ship touched and a few feet around it, this effect became evident, though after the ship had passed, the ground would return to its usual stable state. This was why the trees of the forest had swayed as the ship passed through them, parting before the keel as the ship sailed towards Umbria. The ship which sails over land and sea was not particularly large. Certainly she was considerably smaller than a Melnibone battle barge, and only a little bigger than a southern galley. But the grace of her, the curve of her line, the pride of her bearing, in these she had no rival at all. Already her gangplanks had been lowered down to the ground, and she was being made ready for her journey. Elric, hands on his slim hips, stood looking up at King Strasha's gift. From the gates of the city, wall slaves were bearing provisions and arms and carrying them up the gangways. Meanwhile, Divim was assembling the Amrurian warriors and assigning them their ranks and duties while on the expedition. There were not many warriors. Only half the available strength could come with the ship, for the other half must remain behind under the command of Admiral Margum Colum and protect the city. It was unlikely that there would be any large attack on Melnibone after the punishment meted out onto the barbarian fleet, but it is wise to take precautions, particularly since Prince Ercune had vowed to conquer Umbria. Also, for some strange reason that none of the onlookers could divine, Divim had called for volunteers, veterans who shared a common disability, and made up a special detachment of these men who, so the onlookers thought, could be of no use at all on the expedition. Still, neither were they of use when it came to defending the city, so they might as well go. These veterans were led aboard first. Last to climb the gangway was Elric himself. He walked slowly, heavily, a proud figure in his black armour, until he reached the deck. Then he turned, saluted the city, and ordered the gangplank raised. Divim was waiting for him on the poop deck. The Lord of the Dragon Caves had stripped off one of his gauntlets and was running his naked hand over the oddly coloured wood of the rail. "This is not a ship made for war, Elric. I should not like to see it harmed." "Well, how can it be harmed?" Elric asked lightly as Umrerians began to climb the rigging and adjust the sails. "Would Strasha let it be destroyed? Would Grome? Fear not for the ship which sails over land and sea, Divim. Fear only for our own safety and the success of our expedition. Now, let us consult the charts." Remembering Strasha's warning concerning his brother Grome, "I suggest we travel by sea for as far as possible, calling in here," he pointed to a seaport on the western coast of Lormir, "to get our bearings and learn what we can of the lands of Oin and Hugh, and how those lands are defended. Well, few travellers have ever ventured beyond Lormere. It is said that the edge of the world lies not far from that country's own most southerly borders. Diventvar frowned. Could not this whole mission be a trap, I wonder? Ariok's trap? What if he is in league with Prince Urkun and we have been completely deceived into embarking upon an expedition which will destroy us? I have considered that, said Elric, but there is no other choice. We must trust Ariok. I suppose we must, Diventvar smiled ironically. Another matter now occurs to me. How does the ship move? I saw no anchors we could raise, and there are no tides that I know of that sweep across the land. The wind fills the sails, see? It was true the sails were billowing and the masts creaked slightly as they took the strain. Elric shrugged and spread his hands. I suppose we must tell the ship, he suggested. Ship, we are ready to sail. Elric took some pleasure in Diventvar's expression of astonishment as, with a lurch, the ship began to move. It sailed smoothly as over a calm sea, and Diventvar instinctively clutched the rail, shouting, "But we are heading directly for the city wall." Elric crossed quickly to the centre of the poop, where a large lever lay, horizontally attached to a ratchet, which in turn was attached to a spindle. This was almost certainly the steering gear. Elric grasped the lever as one might grasp an oar and pushed it round a notch or two. Immediately the ship responded, and turned towards another part of the wall. Elric hauled back on the lever and the ship leaned, protesting a little as she yawed around and began to head out across the island. Elric laughed in delight. You see, Diventvar? It is easy. A slight effort of logic was all it took. Nonetheless, said Diventvar suspiciously, I'd rather we rode dragons. At least they are beasts and may be understood. But this sorcery, it troubles me. Well, those are not fitting words for a noble of Melnibone, Elric shouted above the sound of the wind and the rigging, the creaking of the ship's timbers, the slap of the great white sails. Perhaps not, said Diventvar. Perhaps that explains why I stand beside you now, my lord. Elric darted his friend a puzzled look before he went below to find a helmsman whom he could teach how to steer the ship. The ship sped swiftly over rocky slopes and up gorse-covered hills. She cut her way through forests and sailed grandly over grassy plains. She moved like a low-flying hawk, which keeps close to the ground but progresses with incredible speed and accuracy as it searches for its prey, altering its course with an imperceptible flick of a wing. The soldiers of Imria crowded her decks, gasping in amazement as the ship's progress over the land, and many of the men had to be clouted back to their positions at the sails or elsewhere about the ship. The huge warrior who acted as boatswain seemed the only member of the crew unaffected by the miracle of the ship. He was behaving as he would normally behave aboard one of the golden battle barges, going solidly about his duties and seeing to it that all was done in a proper seamanly manner. The helmsman Elric had selected was, on the other hand, wide-eyed and somewhat nervous of the ship he handled. You could see that he felt he was at any moment going to be dashed against a slab of rock or smash the ship apart in a tangle of thick-trunked pines. He was forever wetting his lips and wiping sweat from his brow, even though the air was sharp and his breath steamed as it left his throat. Yes, he was a good helmsman, and gradually he became used to handling the ship, though his movements were, perforce, more rapid, for there was little time to deliberate upon a decision. The ship travelled with such speed over the land. The speed was breathtaking. They sped more swiftly than any horse, were swifter even than Diventvar's beloved dragons. Yet the motion was exhilarating too, and as the expressions on the faces of all Amrurians told. Elric's delighted laughter rang through the ship and infected many other members of the crew. Well, if Grome of the Roots is trying to block our progress, I hesitate to guess how fast we shall travel when we reach water, he called to Diventvar. Diventvar had lost some of his earlier mood. His long, fine hair streamed around his face as he smiled at his friend. "Aye, we shall all be whisked off the deck and into the sea." And then, as if in answer to their words, the ship began suddenly to buck and at the same time sway from side to side, like a ship caught in powerful cross-currents. The helmsman went white and clung to his lever, trying to get the ship back under control. There came a brief, terrified yell, and a sailor fell from the highest cross-tree into the mainmast and crashed onto the deck, breaking every bone in his body. And then the ship swayed once or twice, and the turbulence was behind them, and they continued on their course. Elric stared at the body of the fallen sailor. Suddenly the mood of gaiety left him completely, and he gripped the rail in his black gauntleted hands, gritted his strong teeth, and his crimson eyes glowed, and his lips curled in self-mockery. "What a fool I am, to tempt the gods so." Still, though the ship moved almost as swiftly as it had done, there seemed to be something dragging at it, as if Grome's minions clung onto the bottom as barnacles might cling in the sea. And Elric sensed something around him in the air, something in the rustling of the trees through which they passed, something in the movement of the grass and the bushes and the flowers over which they crossed, something in the weight of the rocks, of the angle of the hills. And he knew that what he sensed was the presence of Grome of the ground, Grome of the land below the roots, Grome who desired to own what he and his brother Strasha had once owned jointly, what they had made as a sign of the unity between them, and over which they had fought. Grome very much wanted to take back the ship which sails over land and sea, and Elric, staring down at the black earth, became afraid. Chapter 7. King Grome. But at last, with the land tugging at their keel, they reached the sea, sliding into the water and gathering speed with every moment, until Melnibone was gone behind them and they were sighting the thick clouds of steam which hung forever over the boiling sea. Elric thought it unwise to risk even this magical vessel in those peculiar waters, so the vessel was turned and headed for the coast of Lormir, sweetest and most tranquil of the young kingdom nations, and the port of Ramessaz on Lormir's western shore. If the southern barbarians with whom they had so recently fought had been from Lormir, Elric would have considered making for some other port, but the barbarians had almost certainly been from the southeast, on the far side of the continent, beyond Picarade. The Lormirians, under their fat, cautious King Fidan, were not likely to join a raid unless its success were completely assured. Sailing slowly into Ramessaz, Elric gave instructions that their ship be moored in a conventional way and treated like any ordinary ship. It attracted attention nonetheless for its beauty, and the inhabitants of the port were astonished to find Melniboneans crewing the vessel. Though Melniboneans were disliked throughout the young kingdoms, they were also feared. Thus, outwardly at any rate, Elric and his men were treated with respect and were served reasonably good food and wine in the hostelries they entered. In the largest of the waterfront inns, a place called Heading Outward and Coming Safely Home Again, Elric found a garrulous host who had, until he brought the inn, been a prosperous fisherman and who knew the southernmost shores reasonably well. He certainly knew the lands of Oin and Hugh, but he had no respect for them at all. "You think they could be massing for war, my lord?" He raised his eyebrows at Elric before hiding his face in his wine mug. Wiping his lips, he shook his red head. "Then they must war against sparrows. Oin and Hugh are barely nations at all. Their only halfway decent city is Dos Cam, and that is shared between them, half being on one side of the river Ar and half being on the other. And as for the rest of Oin and Hugh, it is inhabited by peasants who are for the most part so ill-educated and superstition-ridden that they are poverty-stricken, not a potential soldier among them." "You've heard nothing of a Melnibonean renegade who has conquered Oin and Hugh and set about training these peasants to make war?" Divimtvar leaned on the bar next to Elric. He sipped fastidiously from a thick cup of wine. Prince Erkun is the renegade's name. Is that whom you seek? The innkeeper became more interested. A dispute between the dragon princes, eh? That's our business, said Elric haughtily. Of course, my lords. You know nothing of a great mirror which steals men's memories? Divimtvar asked. A magical mirror? The innkeeper threw back his head and laughed heartily. I doubt if there's one decent mirror in the whole of Oin or you. No, my lords, I think you are misled if you fear danger from those lands. Well, doubtless you are right, said Elric, staring down into his own untasted wine, for it would be wise if we were to check for ourselves. And it would be in Lormia's interests, too, if we were to find what we seek and warn you accordingly. Fear not for Lormia. We can deal easily with any silly attempt to make war from that quarter. But if you'd see for yourselves, you must follow the coast for 3 days until you come to a great bay. The river Ar runs into that bay, and on the shores of the river lies Dros Kham, a seedy sort of a city, particularly for a capital serving 2 nations. The inhabitants are corrupt, dirty and disease-ridden, but fortunately they're also lazy and thus afford little trouble, especially if you keep a sword by you. When you have spent an hour in Dros Kham, you will realise the impossibility of such folk becoming a menace to anyone else, unless they should get close enough to you to infect you with one of their several plagues. Again the innkeeper laughed hugely at his own wit. As he ceased shaking, he added, or unless you fear their navy, it consists of a dozen or so filthy fishing boats, most of which are so unseaworthy they dare only fish within the shallows of the estuary. Elric pushed his wine cup aside. We thank you, landlord. He placed a Melnibone silver piece upon the counter. This will be hard to change, said the innkeeper craftily. There is no need to change it on our account, Elric told him. I thank you, masters. Would you stay the night at my establishment? I can offer you the finest beds in Ramassaz. I think not, Elric told him. We shall sleep aboard our ship tonight, that we might be ready to sail at dawn. The landlord watched the Melniboneans depart. Instinctively he bit at the silver piece, and then, suspecting he tasted something odd about it, removed it from his mouth. He stared at the coin, turning it this way and that. Could Melnibonean silver be poisonous to an ordinary mortal, he wondered? It was best not to take risks. He tucked the coin into his purse and collected up the 2 wine cups they had left behind. Though he hated waste, he decided it would be wiser to throw the cups out, lest they should have become tainted in some way. The ship which sails over land and sea reached the bay at noon on the following day, and now it lay close inshore, hidden from a distant city by a short isthmus on which grew thick, near-tropical foliage. Elric and Divimtvar waded through the clear, shallow water to the beach and entered the forest. They had decided to be cautious and not make their presence known until they had determined the truth of the innkeeper's contemptuous description of Dros Kham. Near the tip of the isthmus was a reasonably high hill, and growing up on the hill were several good-sized trees. Elric and Divimtvar used their swords to clear a path through the undergrowth and made their way up the hill until they stood under the trees, picking out one that most easily climbed. Elric selected a tree whose trunk was bent and then straightened out again. He sheathed his sword, got his hands onto the trunk and hauled himself up, clambering along until he reached a succession of thick branches which would bear his weight. In the meantime, Divimtvar climbed another nearby tree until at last both men could get a good view across the bay, where the city of Dros Kham could be clearly seen. Certainly the city itself deserved the innkeeper's description. It was squat and grimy and evidently poor. Doubtless this was why Erkun had chosen it, for the lands of Oin and Yu could not have been hard to conquer with the help of a handful of well-trained Imrerians and some of Erkun's sorceress allies. Indeed, few would have bothered to conquer such a place, since its wealth was plainly virtually non-existent and its geographical position of no strategic importance. Erkun had chosen well for purposes of secrecy, if nothing else, but the landlord had been wrong about Dros Kham's fleet. Even from here, Elric and Divimtvar could make out a good 30 good-sized warships in the harbour. There seemed to be more anchored upriver. But the ships did not interest them as much as the thing which flashed and glittered above the city, something which had been mounted on huge pillars which supported an axle, which, in turn, supported a vast circular mirror, set in a frame whose workmanship was as plainly non-mortal as that of the ship which had brought the Melniboneans here. There was no doubt they looked upon the mirror of memory, and that any who sailed into their harbour after it had been erected must have had their memory of what they had been stolen, must have had their memory of what they had seen stolen from them instantly. "It seems to me, my lord," said Divimtvar from his perch a yard or two away from Elric, "that it would be unwise of us to sail directly into the harbour of Doscam. Indeed, we could be in danger if we entered the bay. I think that if we look upon the mirror, even now, only it is because it is not pointed directly at us. But you notice there is machinery to turn it in any direction its user chooses, save one. It cannot be turned inland behind the city. There is no need for it, for who would approach Oin and Yu from the wastelands beyond their borders, and who but the inhabitants of Oin or Yu would need to come overland to their capital? I think I take your meaning, Divimtvar. You suggest that we should be wise to make use of the special properties of our ship, and to go overland to Doscam, striking suddenly and making full use of those veterans we brought with us, moving swiftly and ignoring Prince Erkun's new allies, seeking the prince himself and his renegades. Could we do that, Elric? Dash into the city, seize Erkun, rescue Cimmeral, and speed out again and away? Since we have too few men to make a direct assault, it is all we can do, though it is dangerous. The advantage of surprise would be lost, of course, once we had made the attempt. If we failed in our first attempt, it would become much harder to attack a second time. The alternative is to sneak into the city at night and hope to locate Erkun and Cimmeral alone, but then we should not be making use of our one important weapon, the ship which sails over land and sea. I think your plan is the best one, Divimtvar. Let us turn the ship inland now and hope that Grome takes his time in finding us, for I still worry lest he try seriously to wrest the ship from our possession. Elric began to climb down towards the ground. Standing once more upon the poop deck of the lovely ship, Elric ordered the helmsman to turn the vessel once again towards the land. Under half sail the ship moved gracefully through the water and up the curve of the bank, and its flowering shrubs of the forest parted before its prow, and then they were sailing through the green dark of the jungle while startled birds cawed and shrilled, and little animals paused in astonishment and peered down from the trees at the ship which sails over land and sea. And some almost lost their balance as the graceful boat progressed calmly over the floor of the forest, turning aside for only the thickest of the trees. And thus they made their way to the interior of the land called Oin, which lay to the north of the river Ar, which marked the border between Oin and land Yu, with which Oin shared a single capital. Oin was a country consisting largely of unforested jungle and infertile plains where the inhabitants farmed, for they feared the forest and would not go into it, even though that was where Oin's wealth might be found. The ship sailed well enough through the forest and out over the plain, and soon they could see a large lake glinting ahead of them, and Divimtvar, glancing at the crude map with which he had furnished himself and Ramessaz, suggested that they begin to turn towards the south again and approach Doscam by means of a wide semicircle. Elric agreed, and the ship began to tack round. It was then that the land began to heave again, and huge waves of grassy earth this time rolled around the ship and blotted out the surrounding view. The ship pitched wildly up and down and from side to side. 2 more Meridians fell from the rigging and were killed on the deck below. The boatswain was shouting loudly, though in fact all this upheaval was happening in silence, and the silence made the situation seem that much more menacing. The boatswain yelled to his men to tie themselves to their positions. "All those not doing anything, get below at once," he added. Elric had wound a scarf around the rail and tied the other end to his wrist. Divim Tvar had used a long belt for the same purpose, but still they were flung in all directions, often losing their footing as the ship bucked this way and that, and every bone in Elric's body seemed about to crack, and every inch of his flesh seemed bruised, and the ship was creaking and protesting and threatening to break up under the awful strain of riding the heaving land. "Is this Grome's work, Elric?" Divim Tvar panted, "or some sorcery of Urkun's?" Elric shook his head. "Not Urkun, it is Grome, and I know no way to placate him. Not Grome, who thinks least of all the kings of the elements, yet perhaps is the most powerful. But surely he breaks his bargain with his brother by doing this to us." "No, I think not. King Strasha warned us this might happen. We can only hope that Grome expends all his energy and that the ship survives, as it might survive a natural storm at sea." "Well, this is worse than a sea storm, Elric." Elric nodded in agreement, but could say nothing, for the deck was tilting at a crazy angle, and he had to cling to the rails with both hands in order to retain any kind of footing. And now the silence stopped. Instead they heard a rumbling and a roaring that seemed to have something of the character of laughter. "King Grome!" Elric shouted. "King Grome, let us be! We have done you no harm!" But the laughter increased, and it made the whole ship quiver as the land rose and fell around it, as trees and hills and rocks rushed towards the ship and then fell away again, never quite engulfing them, for Grome doubtless wanted his ship intact. "Grome, you have no quarrel with mortals," Elric cried again. "Let us be. Ask a favour if you must, but grant us this favour in return." Elric was shouting almost anything that came into his head. Really, he had no hope of being heard by the Earth God, and did not expect King Grome to bother to listen, even if the elemental did hear. But there was nothing else to do. "Grome! Grome, listen to me!" Elric's only response was in the louder laughter, which made every nerve in him tremble, and the earth heaved higher and dropped lower, and the ship spun round and round until Elric was sure he would lose his senses entirely. "King Grome, is it just to slay those who have never done you harm?" And then slowly the heaving earth subsided, and the ship was still, and a huge brown figure stood looking down at the ship. The figure was the colour of earth and looked like a vast old oak. His hair and his beard were the colour of leaves, and his eyes were the colour of gold ore, and his teeth were the colour of granite, and his feet were like roots, and his skin seemed covered in tiny green shoots in place of hair, and he smelled rich and musty and good, and he was King Grome of the earth elementals. He sniffed and frowned, and he said in a soft, mighty voice that was yet coarse and grumpy, "I want my ship." "Well, it is not our ship to give, King Grome," said Elric. Grome's tone of petulance increased. "I want my ship," he said slowly. "I want the thing. It is mine." "Of what use is it to you, King Grome?" "Use? It is mine!" Grome stamped and the land rippled. Elric said desperately, "It is your brother's ship, King Grome. It is King Strasha's ship. He gave you part of his domain, and you allowed him to keep the ship. That was the bargain." "I know nothing of a bargain. The ship is mine." "You know that if you take the ship, then King Strasha will have to take back the land he gave you." "I want my ship." The huge figure shifted its position, and bits of earth fell around it, landing with distinctly heard thuds on the ground below and on the deck of the ship. "Well, then you must kill us to obtain it," Elric says. "Kill? Grome does not kill mortals. He kills nothing. Grome builds. Grome brings to life. You have already killed 3 of our company, Elric pointed out. 3 are dead, King Grome, because you made the landstorm. Grome's great brows drew together, and he scratched his great head, causing an immense rustling noise to sound. Grome does not kill, he said again. King Grome has killed, said Elric reasonably. 3 lives lost. Grome grunted. But I want my ship. The ship is lent to us by your brother. We cannot give it to you. Besides, we sail in it for a purpose. A noble purpose, I think. I know nothing of purposes and care nothing for you. I want my ship. My brother should not have lent it to you. I had almost forgotten it. But now that I remember it, I want it. Will you not accept something else in place of the ship, King Grome? Said Divimtvar suddenly. Some other gift. Grome shook his monstrous head. How could a mortal give me something? It is mortals who take from me all the time. They steal my bones and my blood and my flesh. Could you give me back all that your kind has taken? Is there not one thing? Elric said. Grome closed his eyes. Precious metals? Jewels? Suggested Divimtvar. We have many such in Melnibone. I have plenty, said King Grome. Elric shrugged in despair. How can we bargain with a god, Divimtvar? He gave a bitter smile. What can the Lord of Soil desire? More sun? More rain? These are not ours to give. I am a rough sort of god, said Grome, if indeed god I am. But I did not mean to kill your comrades. I have an idea. Give me the bodies of the slain. Bury them in my earth. Elric's heart leapt. That is all you wish of us? It would seem much to me. And for that you will let us sail on? On water, aye, growled Grome, but I do not see why I should allow you to sail over my land. It is too much to expect of me. You can go to yonder lake, but from now this ship will only possess the properties bestowed upon it by my brother Strasha. No longer shall it cross my domain. But King Grome, we need this ship. We are upon urgent business. We need to sail to the city yonder. Elric pointed in the direction of Dozcam. You may go to the lake, but after that the ship will sail only on water. Now give me what I ask. Elric called down to the boatswain, who, for the first time, seemed amazed by what he was witnessing. Bring up the bodies of the 3 dead men. The bodies were brought up from below. Grome stretched out one of his great earthy hands and picked them up. I thank you, he growled. Farewell. And slowly Grome began to descend into the ground, his whole huge frame becoming, atom by atom, absorbed until the earth again was gone. Absorbed with the earth until he was gone. And then the ship was moving again, slowly towards the lake, on the last short voyage it would ever make upon the land. And thus our plans are thwarted, said Elric. Divimtvar looked miserably towards the shining lake. Aye, so much for that scheme. I hesitate to suggest this to you, Elric, but I fear we must resort to sorcery again if we are to stand any chance of achieving our goal. Elric sighed. I fear we must, he said.